Hi everyone, I'm back. It's Stephanie Thompson. Welcome back to Read Your Library. And today we have a little bit of a change of venue. As you can see, for once we're not actually in my library. And that's because this episode is all about podcasts. Recently I did an episode about the book Freakonomics based on the Freakonomics podcast, and I've also spoken about Malcolm Gladwell's podcast Revisionist History in the past. And one of my faithful subscribers asked me if I would do an episode all about my favorite podcasts, and I was delighted to hear that. So today that's what we're going to talk about. Now, for those of you who don't know, I can't imagine there's anybody out there who still doesn't know what a podcast is, but basically it's like a radio show, but that is either converted from a radio show or made specifically for the internet. And the nice thing about podcasts compared to radio shows is that you can download them and listen to them anytime. It doesn't have to just be when you're near a radio or at a specific time of week like a radio show. And a lot of podcasts actually started out as radio shows, and public radio in particular is famous for creating shows that then became podcasts. But now a lot of podcasts are being made without going to radio first, and there are whole media companies that are created just to make podcasts, including Gimlet Media, Crooked Media, and there's a couple of companies like PRX and Radiotopia that do both radio shows and just podcasts. What to look for in a podcast? Well, every news organization and just about every organization with a media presence has a podcast now. The technology to make them and to distribute them is super accessible and super cheap, so everybody has them. You can find one for literally anything. Anything you're interested in, any hobby, any type of business or work that you do, any kind of media you enjoy, there's a podcast about it. Almost all of them are free and downloadable, so they're perfect to fill space. For example, I listen to a lot of podcasts when I'm doing chores that are otherwise tedious or that take some time out of the house, like when I'm walking my dog, when I'm doing laundry or housekeeping. Pretty much anything where I have time to fill, I'll put in a podcast, and that way I can keep up with my favorites. So let's start with the granddaddy of modern podcasting. And you probably have guessed that I'm talking about This American Life. I'm holding up logos because obviously, unlike books, there's nothing to hold up when you talk about a podcast. This American Life started out as a public radio show many, many years ago, created and hosted by Ira Glass. And it's really become famous because it really was the first show to do what it did, which is essentially narrative journalism. And what that means is journalism, but not straight news, journalism that tells a story. It's a slower pace, it takes a lot longer to create, it's very artistic. Ira Glass has become famous for having this kind of narrative style of speaking, of telling a story, and almost all the episodes of This American Life tell 3 or 4 different stories on one same theme. And really it's become such a part of the media landscape, this one podcast and show, that people are now making jokes about it. They're making parodies, they make fun of his voice, of the pacing, the random bits of instrumental music that are played in along with the talking. But really it is an amazing show, and it's really the gateway drug, is how I like to put it. If you start listening to This American Life, you will want to continue listening to other podcasts. In fact, it's thanks to Ira Glass and This American Life that people like me discovered David Sedaris for the first time, David Rakoff, Mike Birbiglia, who went on to make a couple of movies and is now starring on TV, Sarah Koenig, who has a spin-off podcast of her own. These are all people who have worked with Ira Glass on This American Life or appeared as guests, and that just either launched them or increased their fame. There are a few spin-offs of This American Life in the sense that stories or ideas that became their own podcasts. For example, they did an amazing multi-part series called The Giant Pool of Money, trying to explain the financial crisis, which was so popular that it span off a podcast I also listen to called Planet Money, which is all about economics and finances. Other spin-offs you may have heard of are Serial and S-Town, both of which debuted to much fanfare. Serial has had 2 seasons now. Its first season, investigating a particular murder case, has led to the case being reopened in court and a new trial being ordered. So this is serious business, but it's also very, very entertaining listening. So that's This American Life. After This American Life, my next favorite podcast, which I started listening to after I discovered podcasts, is Radiolab. Radiolab's also very famous. It also got its start on public radio. The hosts and creators are Jad Abumrad and Robert Krulwich. And what Radiolab talks about are kind of the oddities and incredible stories about our strange world, is how they like to put it. And through Radiolab, I think I've discovered more amazing things than through any other podcast or show. And I've had more of those driveway moments, they call them, which are moments when you get to where you're going in the car, but you just can't get out of the car if you're listening to it on the radio, because you absolutely have to hear what happens next or what the conclusion is. Radiolab, here's the logo, if you're looking for it in your app store. So Radiolab, I love. The only thing about it that sometimes annoys me is Robert Krulwich can be a little didactic, or maybe pedantic even. He has some opinions that just don't generally jibe with mine, which is fine. But sometimes when he weighs in on certain things, it tends to annoy me. But he and Jad Abumrad play well off of each other. Some of the amazing episodes I would recommend, I mean, they're all amazing, but some of the ones that have really stayed with me, Oliver Sacks, the late, great neuroscientist and writer, was a wonderful guest of theirs frequently. Any of the episodes that feature him are amazing. There's an amazing episode about a family with an autistic son that discover that a way that he can relate to the world and communicate is through Disney characters. It's called Juicervos. It's amazing. An episode called Rhino Hunter, which is one of the ones that really has shocked me more than any other episode. And a wonderful episode called Space. The part about it that I loved the most, that brought me to tears, was an interview with the widow of Carl Sagan, Anne Druyan, in which she talked about how she and Carl made the famous golden record that was sent into space on Voyager. An amazing episode that really touched me. Other episodes that have really made me think and changed the way I think about things, or really forced me to rethink my opinion on things, is one called Blame, which is all about whether people are responsible or not for their actions depending on the neural and brain condition they have. For example, brain damage that changes your behavior and causes you to do criminal behavior, whether you should be held criminally responsible for that if it's as a result of brain damage. An episode called Colors, which will introduce you to the amazing mantis shrimp, whose eyes can see millions and millions of colors, if you can even imagine that, and who also punches supersonically through the water. And also one of the ones that really stayed with me is called Los Frikis, and it's about a community of artists in Cuba that, under the oppressive communist regime, found that if they became infected with AIDS and were ostracized to live in their own artists' colony, it actually afforded them a different kind of artistic freedom and a different way of life, and to the point that some of them infected themselves on purpose. So that's thought-provoking. Talking about these favorite episodes reminds me that I didn't mention my favorite episodes of This American Life when I mentioned it a second ago, and I'm looking for those now. But there are, as I said, many amazing episodes of This American Life, and where did it go? And if you just dip into it, you'll find that, you know, almost anywhere you start in its entire history, the whole history of This American Life is on the web, and almost anywhere you start, you will find amazing episodes to entertain you. Some of the ones that I particularly liked, Switched at Birth, that gives you an idea of what those stories were about. 3 Miles. There's one called Breakup, which features Phil Collins, a reporter calling up Phil Collins to talk about how sad she is at her breakup, and she ends up having this long discussion with him about how to get over a breakup, which is really fascinating. Scenes from a Mall, all about mall culture. One last thing before I go, this is This American Life we're talking about now, which is about death, but one part of that episode in particular about this phone booth in Japan that isn't connected to anything, where people go to talk to their dead loved ones, blew my mind. Amazing. So let's start with those. This American Life, Radiolab. Those are only 2 of the podcasts that I really love. I have many more to talk about, but I don't want these videos to get too long, so I will cut off at this point, and we'll come back in the next video and talk about the next couple of podcasts I'd like you to try out. So this is Stephanie Thompson again. Read your library and listen to this podcast, and I'll talk to you soon. Thanks.